have another.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies here at AEI. Delighted to have you with us today for what I suspect is going to be a engaging and pretty lively conversation. The topic is the closed-minded campus, the stifling of ideas in American universities. If you haven't heard, there's been a little conversation the last year or two about whether or not campuses, in their concern for being sensitive to student concerns, for being empathetic, have perhaps gone too far in their embrace of safe zones and trigger warnings and general discomfort with the stuff of ideological debate and free speech. We'll get into that today. A couple of things before I turn it over to Ramesh, who is going to steer us through the conversation. First, if you got cell phones, please put them on silent. Second, if you want to follow along on Twitter or engage, the hashtag is C's on campus. That's capital C, plural S, on capital C campus. And the full video of today's conversation will be available tomorrow online. With that, I want to hand the panel over to Ramesh Ponnuru. Ramesh is a visiting fellow at AEI, a senior editor at National Review, a columnist for Bloomberg View, and a man who has every once in a while wandered into some of these relatively heated conversations. Hey, thanks for doing this, Ramesh.
Thanks, Rick. We've got a great panel to talk about a very important topic. I am just going to introduce them, and then we're going to dive right in. Joshua Dunn is a professor of political science, director of the Center for the Study of Government and the Individual at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And he is, of course, the co-author of the book that we're using as our launching off point, Passing on the Right, Conservative Professors in the Progressive University. I think it is a little bit odd for me to introduce the person who just spoke, but Rick Hess deserves an introduction. He is a resident scholar and director of education policy studies here at AEI. He is the author of the popular Education Week blog, Rick Hess Straight Up. I mean, frankly, who else could write that one? And contributes to numerous media outlets. He's a former high school social studies teacher and teaches or has taught at the University of Virginia, the University of Pennsylvania, Georgetown University, Rice University, and Harvard University. Hopefully not all of those at the same time. John Shields is an associate professor of government at Claremont McKenna College and the other co-author of our book, Passing on the Right. Christina Hoff Sommers is a colleague of mine at AEI. She's a resident scholar and a former philosophy professor who taught ethics, and she is well known for her critique of late 20th century feminism and for her extensive writings, among them Who Stole Feminism and the War Against Boys. She has spoken on numerous college campuses and is intimately familiar with some of the issues of closed-mindedness that we'll be talking about today. And then finally, Stephen Tellis is an associate professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. He was previously an associate professor of public policy at the University of Maryland and a visiting lecturer at Yale University Law School. His areas of specialty include social policy, law and public policy, and political analysis. So we've got a very distinguished panel. That's why that took so long. And now we are going to dive in. I'm going to start in just a minute. I'm going to ask Professors Dunn and Shields to talk a little bit about their main findings in this book. But first, I want to quote from the book what I find to be the most striking passage. It's just 2 paragraphs long in the book, on page 83, if you want to follow along. We met our first closeted professor in a leafy park, about 1 mile from his prestigious Research One university. Though we found a secluded spot, our subject was edgy and spoke softly. When the sound of footsteps intruded on our sanctuary, he stopped talking altogether, his eyes darting about. As the sound of footsteps receded into the distance, the promise of anonymity returned and our interview resumed. Given the drama of this encounter, one might think that he is concealing something scandalous. In truth, this professor is hiding the fact that he is a Republican. It is a secret he guards with great care. So tell us, just how closed-minded are universities these days, and how do they get this way? Maybe Professor Dunn, you could start for us?
Sure. Well, it depends. One of our findings was that in some disciplines they were much more open, I think, than we expected going in, and then others are much more closed. Economics is particularly open. We interviewed 153 professors in 6 disciplines, 3 from social sciences, the social sciences, 3 from the humanities, so economics, political science, sociology, and then history, literature, and philosophy. And we interviewed them and then also surveyed them to get a measure, some sense of their sense of isolation, how much they feel perhaps politically persecuted. And economists almost reported no sense of persecution. They never hid their political views. In fact, they were shocked when we would ask them these questions. When we gave them the survey, he was taking the survey with questions trying to measure these things, and he just looked at me and he said, "Do people in other disciplines actually worry about this?" It was like he was in a different universe than people in other disciplines. Surprisingly to me, I came away with greater fondness for my own discipline, political science. After this, it's much more open than many other disciplines. There are pockets in various branches of political science where conservatives can live safely and do their work without harassment. Sometimes they do feel the need to hide their politics, but generally they can get along better than others. Folks in other disciplines. Then in other disciplines, it's very difficult. So just one indication of that was our difficulty finding sociologists. It was just extremely difficult. So we started with people that we knew who were self-identified conservatives. And then we had to use a snowball sample, which the fact that we had to use a snowball sample, I think, is interesting because that's a method you use for difficult to locate populations like the homeless. And so we tried to find sociologists, and we found very few. So those were some of our findings, so I don't let John say a little bit more about them.
Sure. Well, on sociology, there are about 6,000 sociologists in this country, and after looking for months, we found 12 conservative sociologists, and we felt like that was pretty good, actually. We didn't think we were going to get to 12. So in some disciplines, of course, conservatives are very scarce, and in general, conservatives are badly outnumbered in the social sciences. In fact, conservatives are so scarce that they're badly outnumbered by Marxists. So in the social sciences, about 18% of social scientists self-identify as Marxist, about 5% identify as conservatives, and a lot of those conservatives tend to cluster in a handful of subfields, and in economics in particular. Their numbers are also going down. The number of conservatives has declined modestly since about 1990. They're so poorly represented that all other targets of affirmative action are better represented than conservatives. So black academics, Latino academics are better represented. So they're very scarce, and I think Josh is right that their experiences differ quite systematically, right? So if you're in some disciplines or even in some subfields, your experiences aren't so bad. If you're an outspoken conservative, I think especially if you're a cultural conservative, life is much tough. I think if you're someone like Christina, so if you're like Ramesh, if someone of that kind of politics.
Nobody's like me.
Life is considerably tougher. But I would also say that I think we shouldn't imagine that we can somehow eliminate political bias from the academy. I think political bias will always exist because political bias isn't merely an irrational prejudice, right? I mean, so it is true that a lot of, too many liberal academics think that, conservatives are too close-minded to be professors, and that's certainly an irrational prejudice. But it's also true that political bias, in part, reflects an intellectual orientation, right? That is to say, our politics shapes the kinds of questions that we find interesting, the kinds of explanations that we find most plausible. And so as long as that's true, there will be political bias in higher education. And so I don't think conservatives should think that we can somehow eliminate it, or that somehow, there could be a world in which there isn't political bias in higher education. And indeed, precisely because there is political bias, I think that's why diversity is important in higher education, right? You need people with different frames of reference, different points of view, to check other perspectives, and I think that's why diversity is critical.
Could you talk, one of you or both of you, a little bit about the causes of that underrepresentation? How much of it is a result of discrimination of some form or other against conservatives, and how much of it is conservatives not going into the academy?
I don't think it's I don't think discrimination has a lot to do with it, but I do think that at least I don't think that not discrimination in the sense that there's lots of bias at the point of hiring and advancement. There is some, but I don't think that explains the disparity. I think politics does matter, though. I think in certain fields like sociology and history, which have been very leftist disciplines for a long time, I think are just not especially appealing to conservatives. And I think you see this very early. So among undergraduates, for example, the politics of undergraduates is among the best predictors of their major, right? So conservatives tend to gravitate into the natural sciences or into economics, and liberals tend to gravitate to the humanities and social sciences. And so by the time these folks are thinking about PhD programs, they're already marching down very different professional tracks. So I don't think it's surprising that there aren't lots of conservatives in fields like sociology, because there are such leftist disciplines, whereas I think those disciplines really appeal to the left. If you're a young person on the left, it's very, I think, much more appealing to become a sociologist or a historian. So I think it's a selection problem, but it's a selection problem that's that is indeed shaped by the politics of these disciplines.
Rick, I know that you've had some exchanges with the authors, which may have resulted in this panel's formation. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts on this subject.
Sure. First off, I just want to congratulate, John and Josh for, really digging into this. This is a topic that is much easier not to get into than to address. And I think that's part of the problem. When John talks about how do we tell about how much of the tilt on campus is a product of just natural inclination and how much is something more problematic, I think it's important to keep in mind how universities work and how kind of the academic ecosystem works. When John says, well, his history doesn't really appeal to conservatives, that's a funny statement, right? Half a century ago, all academic historians were interested in generals and wars, and people would have said, well, it doesn't appeal to those young lefty types. So what happened, I think, was over a course of a couple of decades, folks, progressives and liberals wound up taking control of some of these disciplines in very substantial ways. Not in any necessarily, not in a violent way, certainly, and not even in a malicious way. But think where the power centers are in universities. It's people who are chairs of university departments, people who are deciding who makes the decisions on tenure and promotion committees, people who sit on the review boards of influential journals, people who decide who gets funded by grants through competitions, people who sit on grant advisory boards for foundations. If those folks who wind up in these positions of influence tend to share a set of priors, what's an interesting question? What are reasonable values? What are good things to explore? What are reasonable policy implications? What happens is you wind up with a relatively tilted playing field as far as what's considered to be empirically interesting, what's considered research worth pursuing, what's considered good and serious scholarship, and what's not. Let me give you a very simple example. It struck me, I was thinking about this panel 2 days ago, and it was in the Washington Post. So it must have been Monday's Washington Post. Page 3, there was about a 20 or 25-inch write-up of a study in the Journal of Violence Against Women So this is a journal that I would strongly suspect most members who were involved in founding this journal, who sit on the editorial board, probably tend to think universities are places where we have suffer from a rape epidemic. The study that was published in this review journal looked at one institution. It was an online voluntary survey of 29 intercollegiate athletes, 150-some intramural athletes, and about 170 other students at this one campus. It was in the write-up in the Washington Post, page 3, there was no reassurance that there had actually been any particular care taken to ensure the identity of these respondents. According to them, more than 50% of the athletes said that they had committed violence against women. More than 50% of the athletes espoused what the authors of the study termed old-fashioned views of gender relationships. And despite the fact that most of the participating athletes were intramural participants, the authors told the Washington Post, and the Washington Post wrote with nary a voice of dissent, that this was a product of the insular competitive isolation of athletes. Well, anybody who has spent time on a campus knows that people who play intramural athletics, this is Frisbee, this is softball, do not live in self-contained dormitories, do not have special classes, do not have special cafeteria facilities. Either the professors who did this stuff actually don't know anything about how intramural athletics works, or they mischaracterized intramural athletics to the Washington Post, or they were simply more focused on telling a larger narrative. In any event, the fact that this plays out routinely and gets high-profile media coverage winds up creating a certain angle to the discourse. If you had written a similarly dubious study making a case for heterosexual marriage as superior to alternative forms of marriage, I am relatively confident you would not get it published in a scholarly journal. You would not find only positive things written about it in major media outlet, and you would not get page 3 play in the Washington Post. So for me, I think that's some of how we think about these dynamics, and some of how they play out every day in the research we consume and what we think it means to be a competent scholar.
I would just quickly add, I agree actually with much of what you say, Rick. I think it is a tilted playing field, but that tilted playing field also creates some advantages for conservatives, right? It's harder to get away with lazy, bad scholarship, right? If you're constantly fighting against the wind, if you have to persuade your reviewers who are not inclined to share your theories, who are not inclined to accept your evidence. And a lot of the conservatives we spoke to said just this, right? That there's some advantages to being a political minority, but it's also the case, right, that there's a long history of outsiders becoming insiders inside of academia, right? So it's true that history became, a one-sided discipline, and that's a problem, right? But what should we do, right? Should we discourage conservatives from going into the academia because it's tilted, right? What advice do we give to them? But also, right, outsiders do become insiders. The nice example is the Chicago School of Economics, right? And there was a group of folks, everybody was a Keynesian sort of after the war. And that's it. So the university may feel very closed at times, but that doesn't mean it's not an institution that's beyond reform or change, right? Or that can't be changed.
You keep looking at me as though you really want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, in a way, the central question, and again, I should say this is an extremely good book. And again, not surprising given the previous work that both scholars did. And in fact, the kind of work that, at least in my discipline, we should do more of, right? Really going and doing serious, in-depth interviewing with people rather than simply trying to sort of try to get answers based on torturing data sets that aren't designed for the purpose. I think some of the secondary research they draw on, I think, has some of that problem, right? And so if I have any problem with the book, it's not so much the work they did, it was the work they drew on. And so I think one of the questions, again, is why are there so few conservatives in the humanities and social sciences? And I think the authors are right that, and again, this reflects my own experience having been on numerous tenure committees, numerous hiring committees, so I have some direct evidence of this. I don't think there's a huge amount of direct discrimination. That is, in some sense, one of the things this raises is problems with a classical model of discrimination to explain outcomes in general. So if we just think about, an outcome, if we see a differential outcome, our usual instinct is there must be some actual discrimination going on. But I think what you're really looking at here is an outcome that's produced by structural factors. And so one thing I want to talk about just a little bit is, well, what are those structural factors that produce this outcome? And I think we can think about 4 of them. One is that, so there's a large imbalance in the first place, right? We're starting in the middle of the flow. We're starting with institutions that already have an enormous disproportion, and I think that in itself tends to reproduce itself even in the absence of action by individuals. Second, conservatives have alternative pathways. We're at 1. Third, the fact that graduate training tends to be highly apprentice-like in character. And finally, the perception rather than the reality of actual discrimination. So the first factor sends a signal, the fact that we have this large imbalance sends a signal to a person considering a career in academia that they're likely to be a minority in the field, right? So I think that a lot of the differential here is way at the beginning of the process, right? Not the part where we usually think, oh, somebody's making a hiring decision. It's far before that, which I think is actually true in lots of cases of differential outcomes, right? That's where and so in addition, right, you've got an endeavor in which there are far fewer jobs than there are potential job seekers, and where the training period is long anyways, right? So, so somebody who's thinking about going in, A, is looking in a field that where there aren't that many conservatives, right? And then they're thinking on top of that, they have all the usual factors that everybody else does. So that's going to have a tendency for them to simply say, I'll do something else, right? Second, if you want to be a conservative thinker or policy person, there are alternatives to academia. Places like AAI, Heritage. I know of many conservatives who would have been natural academics, but either went straight into think tank work or got their PhDs, but eschewed the long, hard slog through the academy and took the relatively, I'll put relatively in a big parentheses, easy way out. So there's an exit option, and I think that matters in determining who goes in and who goes out. Third, academic training involves more than just being admitted to a program. It requires you to develop a very deep bond with a professor, often doing research with them, and then having the professor fight for you in the job market. Conservatives might reasonably suspect that at the margin, they will not get this kind of deep commitment from a professor, even if they are admitted. Fourth, and finally, and this gets at a point that John was getting to near the end, is the perception of actual discrimination in the admissions and eventually the hiring process. There is actual discrimination. They have some evidence of that, which is reinforced by how most admissions and hiring decisions are made. It's not usually necessary that a whole hiring unit be committed to keeping out conservatives, right? It's not like for discrimination to happen, everybody has to get together and say, hey, let's keep the conservatives out. Given the collegial form of decision-making, all it takes is one person on an admissions committee or an entry-level job committee to throw the file on the ding pile to exclude them, or for one person who strongly opposes someone to get them excluded, right? So it may not even be important what the center of the distribution is, right? Just that there's one person on one extreme, right, who's got a very strong preference. Can I just say, that is the cutest baby? I was having a hard time paying attention to the speakers because of how cute that baby was. So that said, my belief is that the perception of discrimination is in fact more important than the reality of it. But that's true in other fields too, where even a small amount of actual discrimination can produce a very large imbalance if the actual amount leads to a widespread belief in position seekers that they will be discriminated against. And this is where, as Dunn and Shields note, conservatives themselves are implicated, right? Conservatives are part of the problem, not part of the solution. For understandable reasons, conservatives have attacked the academy for discriminating against conservatives, but the belief that the academy is discriminatory, when combined with the factors discussed above, can be powerfully self-fulfilling. So finally, there's one other factor I think is worth emphasizing and that the authors emphasize, and that's the degree to which the subject matter of disciplines tends to be a form of structural discrimination. It's hard to miss in a meeting of sociologists how deeply many of them think that the point of the discipline is to advance a left vision of social justice, this vision that I actually have a fair amount of sympathy with. In both history and sociology departments, it's hard to miss that many of the subjects that most attract conservatives, such as the study of military and religion, are quite substantially out of fashion. Ideology has shaped the character of the subject matter of these disciplines, right? So all of those factors, I think, can produce a highly discriminatory outcome, even in the absence of discriminatory intent by individuals.
I want to give one example of what Steve was talking about. In sociology, there's something called public sociology, and public sociology is really just the desire of sociologists to spread the good news of sociology. You can imagine what that is. If you look at job ads for sociology, a very large percentage of them will say that the applicant needs to have a profile of inequality, the standard list that you have in sociology, but then they'll also say public sociology. And by putting public sociology there, it automatically excludes conservatives. Then you have to ask, well, why is this profile in public sociology there? Is it there to prevent conservatives from sneaking in? No, because there aren't any. So it's not because they're overtly trying to keep conservatives out. It's just that this is something that they want to do as a discipline. They think that the public doesn't pay enough attention to what sociologists have to say. And so they want people who will go out there and get engaged in public debates in their communities and nationally. Maybe, of course, it's a good thing that the public hasn't paid as much attention as sociologists would like. But that's an example of how it's a structural feature. There's no overt intent to discriminate with it.
Christina, I'm kind of curious, your experience, that this notion that maybe there's some structural quirks in higher ed, but these are nice people who really want to hear a range of ideas. And, sure, maybe there's a couple more lefties than you'd expect, but it's having no meaningful impact on our ability to have serious discourse.
That would be false. What I find, it does depend on the discipline, of course, but in a study, gender studies, for example, the field is defined by a set of principles that most conservatives wouldn't agree with. For example, the fashion now is intersectionality. And you will find many departments now, but especially gender studies, explicitly saying we are committed to intersectional analysis of society, and that means they view American society as a matrix of oppression, an elaborate hierarchy. And in the old days, people would accuse someone of being racist for having, a set of aggressive and intolerant ideas about another race. Now you can be held liable for unearned privilege. And so there are many more guilty parties, sinning parties. So according to intersectionality, a white male elite has the most unearned privilege, and then it goes down. And then there are people that are that are multiply marginalized, and for example, an African-American gay woman, and there is a fallacy at the heart of this theory, which is that ostensibly it's trying to discourage sexism, racism, classism, but to discourage it, it practices them. So it simply turns on, and it's really being used as almost an excuse for bullying, because you can, everything that the intersectional feminists say that the patriarchal oppressor does to them, that they are excluded, silenced, marginalized, otherized, they actually do that, they try to do that to the guilty, sinful male privileged elite. And so you have a lot on the campus now, a lot of very ugly situations. And there aren't very many conservatives or professors. And now what's happening is they're so carried away with this, with blame. And if someone's privileged, I am not sure how, originally intersectionality, feminist intersectionality, was developed by African-American feminists to actually address some real problems in the women's movement. But now, a lot of, on the campuses, it's a lot of white young women who are running to safe spaces and being triggered because they are oppressed, and so they're carrying on. And now they're going to their even liberal professors and accusing them of not having sufficient numbers of trigger warnings. The campuses, not all, I'm sure yours are an exception, but there's this philosophy of intersectionality, for example, is now creating an environment where I think even liberals aren't going to want to be there.
That feels right to me. I mean, Steve, I guess I would say that I'd be fine with structural dynamics that tilted towards the left in a variety of disciplines if I thought that university governance, if I thought that university culture was clinging tightly to a belief in intellectual heterodoxy, to a conviction that all ideas deserve to be heard and empirical analysis deserve to be pursued on a variety of fronts. That's actually not my experience. My experience very much, certainly in the world of schools of education, which I know best, but I have heard in the last couple months from friends who identify themselves as liberal professors that they have been brought up or gotten at least genteel disciplinary notes from the provost's office because they deigned to use the term illegal immigrant, which is not the appropriate term on campus, that they have not been good about using preferred pronouns. They prefer to use singular pronouns to refer to individuals when these are R1 institutions where campus now requires using them or Z if that is the student. These things seem to me very much questions where we are starting to fundamentally insist in complex, heated cultural debates that one side is right and one side is going to aggressively put its stamp on campus.
Well, again, arguing that something is produced by a structural outcome I don't think is designed to say, oh, well, it's just genteel. The fact that that people are willing to accept an outcome and don't reflect on the structure that produces it, right, makes them implicated in injustice, right? I think that's the same thing as racial inequality, right? Racial inequality is largely produced not by contractual, discriminatory decisions, right? It's produced by the fact that we accept inherited structures that reproduce inequality, right? And so I don't think that's in a way trying to give an out to the people who are doing it, right? If you're faced with a structure that's producing injustice, you have an obligation to do something about it. We can talk about what that is. Now, again, I think the point about heterogeneity of institutions is an important part of the story, and I'd like to hear more from the authors about this. I may have just ended up in a weird set of institutions, and I've been at a fair number of them for my own, out of my own fault. But I'm at Johns Hopkins University now, and the thing that surprises me is how little of the things that everyone says are going on every campus: trigger warnings, safe spaces. It may just be that we have a space crunch, right? But we have as far as I know, we don't have any safe spaces. Again, that may just be a real estate problem. But I do think that one thing is institutions vary. I bet you would find in sociology, not that any sociology departments are particularly open to conservatives, but the real difference is between a sort of hard left and so your ordinary academic liberal, right? And I think one thing you find in sociology is the really elite departments, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, places like that, you don't see a lot of what Josh is talking about in terms of public sociology, in part because the publication standards are so high, right? The expectations of doing original, serious, peer-reviewed research are so high that the opportunity to just do agitation as a career are a lot harder, right? When you start getting to lower tier universities, that's where you start looking at the Cal State system, right? That's where you start seeing sociology just as agitation. So one thing I think that's interesting is the heterogeneity of institutions, and the other thing is the degree to which some of the structural patterns that I'm talking about also influence people who just consider themselves liberals as opposed to people on the left. And I think that's where some kind of coalitional opportunities are possible in some of these areas.
I wanted to ask if any of the panelists thinks that there's a case if the purpose of a university is to be the site for robust debates among multiple points of view, for actually seeking out some of those points of view and having something like affirmative action for conservative professors. The book takes that up. Does anybody actually want to advocate this as a way of, I guess, creating a safe space for conservatives on campus?
Well, I think it would be a good idea if a university, I think Jonathan Haidt suggested this, some university should declare itself a safe space for open debate. And it might be hard to get many conservative professors, but you could at least invite them to campus and dispense with trigger warnings and that kind of thing. And I think that's what we need. We need a few outliers. It isn't not just Hillsdale College and there are a couple of conservative colleges, but I think it would be and I think that has to happen if the universities keep going in the direction they now appear to be going, because a lot of people will just want no part of it. Now, I think what happened, I think the schools are very different from what they were if you graduated in 2012, I think you'd be surprised what's happening on campus right now, because it's a reaction to this. What happened was in 2011, the Department of Education sent this Dear Colleague letter warning deans and professors and officials that their school would be liable, they would lose some funding if they didn't have stringent rules on sexual harassment and sexual assault and so forth. And it included injunctions to control speech, that could be harassing if someone said something. Anyway, the schools were afraid. They went overboard. More importantly, this letter empowered it's a little small group of radicals on campus who have always been there. Since I've been teaching, there were always radicals on campus, but suddenly the administration had to pay attention to them and their grievances. They could litigate. And if you do a Google search of, from 2011, 12, it's still, but then 13, 14, 15, you start seeing trigger warnings. They say this whole culture of paranoia and litigiousness on the campus, it exploded. It's not even clear to me that it's entirely left wing. I don't think the political left wants to have that much to do with it. I think they're embarrassed by it. So it's something that's been unleashed on the campus, and it's a contagion of hysteria, paranoia, but a lot of the administrators are going along with it. And I've heard about many schools. I've heard about this at Hamilton College and Colby College, the small liberal arts college, Swarthmore. They have a bias reporting system. They're monitoring each other, policing. You're constantly getting little notes about something you may have said. So this is a new problem. It might be different from.
The Laura Kipnis case at Northwestern is another great example.
Yes.
Where she writes an op-ed criticizing those Department of Education, essentially regulations, and then people demand an investigation be opened.
They were triggered by her article.
Right.
And she was brought up on a Title IX investigation. Now, some will say, well, the process worked. She was eventually exonerated. No, it didn't work. She shouldn't have been investigated for an article that she wrote, which was completely, in my point of view, completely reasonable. But these neurotics, to me, it seems that we've empowered some very neurotic people on campus, and risk-averse lawyers and deans are going along with it. And now, they're going to expand. They throw $50 million at the problem, at Harvard and at Brown. So they're going to have more triggered people and needs for safe spaces.
Well, I think there's two issues on the table that are worth distinguishing here, right? One is the growth of academic administration, which I think is almost everywhere a kind of plague, has very different sources. We have somebody in the room who is going to be a vice president of a state university system and might look into this. But part of this is top down, right? Part of it is that you have increasing regulations that in the American style are ambiguous and get constructed by administrators who have an incentive to overstate how much jeopardy their institutions are in, right? And because that empowers them, right? I think that's a lot of the dynamic you're seeing. And again, a lot of the faculty don't like this. They don't like the fact that they're losing power to this new administocracy. My colleague Ben Ginsberg wrote a great book about the growth of the administration, what he called the increasingly all-administrative university. I think there's one story which is, and that administocracy has its own kind of ideological principles which tend to be more therapeutic than intellectual. I think that's one kind of agenda. The other question, he wanted to go back to the question that Ramesh asked, which is, are you in favor of affirmative action for conservatives? In part, that depends on what do you mean by affirmative action. I don't want to sound sort of Bill Clinton-esque there and parse language, but part of it depends what you mean by affirmative action. If you mean by affirmative action that at the point of hiring we should be giving people extra points like veterans get when they apply to be, mailmen, then I don't think you should have affirmative action, right? But if you mean by affirmative action that we should accept that we have an outcome that is a kind of equilibrium outcome generated by past injustice of some sort, right? Which I think is a reasonable extrapolation from the findings of this book, then there is an argument for trying to do something about that structure. And one of the things, again, when the book really forced me to think about what would you do other than just complain? Again, there's a large industry of people who like just complaining about, they get space in magazines just to complain about it without actually having anything that suggests how you shift this equilibrium. And so one way I think to shift the equilibrium is that in most institutions, and I know this because I've had long conversations with my own sociology department about a conservative that I wanted them to recruit, and they did successfully. One thing that's important is if you think the equilibrium is produced by perceptions of discrimination rather than just by the presence of discrimination, that it's really important as an as collective action that large numbers of faculty, especially at R1 universities, and the important point here is academia has a very much of a power law distribution in terms of where professors come from, right? They don't come from a huge number of institutions, right? Harvard, Yale, Berkeley, Stanford produce a massively over, large percentage of academics. It's really important for academics to put their cards on the table and say, we want conservatives to apply, right? If you apply, we are going to take you seriously. We're not going to discriminate against you. We're going to take mentoring you seriously, right? It's important for people to put their cards on the table and publicly state that, in part also to throw light on the people who don't. And so I think one thing that's important, somebody like Heterodox Academy, to simply have a list of all the academics who've signed up at least to say, look, we're going to take conservatives seriously. We want them to apply. I think that would have two effects. One is it would reduce the perception of discrimination. If people could simply say, look, there's tons of all these people who've all said that they're going to, they've in a way pre-committed not to act in a discriminatory manner, right? And I think it would send a signal to people, the kind of conservatives who might apply for PhD programs, like many of the research assistants at AAI who might go for PhDs. It would send a signal to them that maybe the academy isn't as discriminatory as, in fact, many of the people on their own side have been telling them there is. So I think one thing is that's a form of collective action that might actually, at least in a small way, help shift some of this equilibrium.
I have a question for the authors. We've been talking a lot about these perceptions of discrimination, and the overall tenor of this conversation, I'd say, has been that there is not as much real discrimination as there is perception of discrimination. It does seem to me that you draw on some research which suggests that a surprisingly large percentage of academics are willing to say things like, I would prefer not to have conservative colleagues, I would prefer not to have Republican colleagues, which suggests there are probably a bunch of other people who have the same view but aren't willing to say it candidly. But I guess one way to get to my question on this is, all of these closeted conservatives that you interviewed, are they being irrational, or do they have a good, legitimate reason for doing what they're doing?
I don't think they're being irrational. I don't know that. I suspect that many of them could be more open than they are, but I don't know their circumstances, and so they're being cautious, and so I'm not going to criticize them for not going out there and flaunting their politics in front of their colleagues when they don't know what the response would be. But many of them have heard things from their colleagues that give them good reason to stay silent and stay in the closet. The sociologist who you read about at the beginning, when he was interviewed for his position, it was right after George Bush was reelected in 2004, and the person who picked him up at the airport told him that the vote the previous day was a vote against the Enlightenment. So that sent a signal to him very early. I mean, he ended up getting the job, and so he's now out of the closet. But he decided to stay in until he was tenured. So I don't think it's completely irrational. But some of it is just driven by the unknown. They just don't know how their colleagues would respond. They hear things in the faculty lounge that obviously indicate that their colleagues don't share their politics, and so the safest course of action for them, or the prudent course of action for them, is to not be open.
Yeah, I basically agree. I mean, I think that it's always easier to accept someone if they have offensive politics, if you get to know them as a friend and sort of take the measure of them. So I think it's a prudent thing for young conservatives to do, to be, circumspect about who they are. I think that's something that troubles Hess, that this is so, right, that conservatives should keep their heads down and but
Circumspection's not big with Rick.
with Rick, yeah, and it's not in everyone's personality, right? It's not in Rick's personality. We interviewed Harvey Mansfield, and he would be incapable, right, of keeping his head down. He would find it unmanly, right, to do something
John,
like that.
And I don't have any problem asking conservatives to abide by the same norms that we
Yeah.
would expect any other junior scholar to abide by.
Yeah.
What troubles me is the notion that conservatives, they have an obligation to be particularly circumspect. I'm not sure why that is either healthy or appropriate.
Maybe it's the conservative virtue of prudence, right? They're careful.
I mean, I guess, but partly in response to what John and Josh are saying, is I guess for me, there's two ways to think about this. In fact, I think to Steve's point that, yes, many folks I have many friends in institutions who love to have a couple of conservatives around. It's good set dressing. They like tokens. They like conservatives particularly who go ahead and write and research stuff that's kind of not too abrasive. They can go off and study things, and it's good if they're good, careful methodologists, and that's fine. Where I think it pinches in really problematic ways is if people actually want to pursue lines of inquiry that are rooted in conservative assumptions or values. So, for instance, if if one is staunchly pro-life, or if one has staunch if one is an absolutist on the Second Amendment, it is going to be enormously uncomfortable to be a normative scholar, actually making the kinds of normative arguments that folks make from the other side routinely in philosophy or sociology departments. And if you are a young scholar trying to do even pretty careful empirical, interesting work on this, in the questions you get asked in the job interview, in the feedback one gets on the variables utilized in the studies from journal reviewers, in challenging questions about policy implications of one's research, I think there is going to be a massively higher standard for what constitutes careful scholarship than if you offered views that were more familiar.
So, Rick, if there was such a person, and it's such a young person who wanted to pursue those lines of inquiry, what would you tell them? Would you say, come and work at AEI, go to a think tank, don't go into academia because it's
No, I would tell them to go to the academy, and unfortunately, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I see them, and I have not felt good about the advice that I've given them. I find that they either get steered into more anodyne research questions, because it's okay to be a conservative so long as your research doesn't actually reflect anything that's fundamentally conservative. Or I find that they go ahead and get the degree and they wind up back at AEI and then going to get hired as a vice president in a higher ed system. But what I have not found is when I have, because I am somebody who has enormous, just as I have enormous, I attach enormous importance to K-12 education because it seems to me foundational on how we understand ourselves in a free country. I have enormous faith in the mission and the nature and the institution of higher education as a place where knowledge is generated, as a place where ideas can be can be debated. And unfortunately, what worries me is I don't actually see that the guardians of higher education have done a particularly good job of what I see as living up to its ideals.
But again, that still doesn't quite tell me what you're supposed to do about it, right? Other than to complain about it. Again, part of the,
So let me-
let me say. I mean, I think part of the problem, right, is that in lots of places it does matter a lot just to have one person. Right, one person in an elite university can build institutions around themselves. Right, one person in an elite institution can attract graduate students. Right, the way the graduate admissions works, usually it's enough for one professor to say, "I really want this person to come and study with me." Right. Now, it may be that a couple of people, have to go in and bang their head or end up at a lesser university or kind of, crawl their way up to do it, right? But unless you tell people, look, you got to just keep banging yourself up. You have to keep banging against the door to get in there. You're not going to do it, right? And that's going to be part of this self-reproducing cycle unless you've got. And that's the thing. I can't quite figure out what the leverage point you want is to do about this, other than to complain about, which doesn't seem to be
So
doing
three
anything.
leverage points. One, I like to see funders fund programs and institutes which create a home for people who are actually going to pursue intellectual agendas that are orthogonal to the dominant,
Discourse.
Right, but just on that, but on that, the problem is that people can only actually fund those institutions once there's somebody there and they're tenured, right? You can't actually, unless you create some completely parallel thing, and those are problematic because those are not, if you get people who just have some kind of soft status, they can't train people, they can't train PhDs, and that's what really, allows you to start really cracking into changing the number of people who are going into the field. So, just creating institutions doesn't do anything if you're not getting people hired in the first place.
Second thing I'd like to see is I'd like to see campuses actually, be shamed and effectively shamed, particularly by their faculty and by the left, when they are disinviting speakers, when they are saying that when they are modifying the terms in which they'll host conservative speakers, saying they'll only host them as part of panels in which their counterparts are there, in which campuses will push back against students who are creating grief for faculty who don't use the preferred words of the left. Third thing I would like to see is I would like to see campuses not engage in affirmative action. I would like to see them actually make serious efforts, though, to reach out to thoughtful, presumably there might be some organizations or outlets or founts of conservative thought that they actually like. These places have 20-somes. I would like to see campuses actually be proactive about trying to seek out new people and stir them into the talent pool. That's a start.
Yes, I agree.
AEI has a strong academic program that has speakers go to campuses, in case anybody is interested in that. I wanted to, before we open this up to the audience, to ask something that's maybe a little bit beyond the scope of the book, but which I find interesting. We usually talk about the tilt of the universities in terms of intolerance and how it's shutting down debate and so on and so forth, and its possible effects on the students. I wonder if there's an effect on conservatism generally as well. Certainly a lot of people have spoken over the last few years about maybe there's an anti-intellectual current on the right that's grown too strong. And I wonder if part of that has to do with the fact that there aren't a whole lot of conservative academics participating in the conversation.
Yeah, I think one reason that my liberal colleagues tend to have a poor view of conservatives is because they associate it almost entirely with its populist expression. So when they think about conservatives, they think about Michelle Bachmann. These days, they think about Donald Trump or Sarah Palin. And I think that's partly because there are so few thoughtful conservatives about. And a great anecdote that really sort of makes this point is Jonathan Haidt, who came up earlier. And Jonathan Haidt he's become a moderate recently, but for years he was a liberal And he talks about browsing in a used bookstore and picking up a copy of Jerry Mueller's volume, which is an anthology of conservative thought. And he started reading the introduction to this volume. And he was about a paragraph in, and he had to sit down. Right? As he put it, he was quite literally floored because he had never encountered anything like this before, right? He had never encountered conservative ideas on this level. And that was really quite astonishing, right? He had already become a professor. He had a very good education. Haidt is a very broad-minded, widely read guy, but he hadn't encountered a volume like Mueller's. It's very hard to imagine this happening in reverse, right? Where, a conservative professor goes to a used bookstore, picks up a volume of Marx or something and having to sit down because, his hair is blown back, right? Because that person is just swimming, right, in those liberal and intellectual currents. And so I think, so I think that a lot of or at least some of the prejudice against conservatives is driven by this problem, right? There's just not enough of us in the university to puncture these prejudices. And that problem won't get better, I don't think, until there's more conservatives in academia.
Yeah, I once I was in a debate about free speech on campus, and I was debating this professor who was defending having mostly liberal professors, and she said, "Look, these kids, all day long, they get the conservative message, drummed into their heads from the mainstream culture, from Rush Limbaugh and talk radio, and we have a few precious hours, and I don't want to waste it." And so they have this image of themselves as sort of, I don't know, the enlightened.
They're the diversity.
They're diversity. They are the diversity. And I said to her, wait a minute. It's not Rush Limbaugh versus you. That's not. There are conservative intellectuals who could be coming to campus. You could be, talking to them, and that's what your students need to hear. And then they will decide. Some of them will be liberal. Some of them will be. I as a college professor, I always thought it was a sacred commandment. Thou shalt teach both sides of the argument. I never saw it as my goal to recruit them to my team, whatever that was, and it never occurred to me. And but this isn't happening, and they think because they've got Rush Limbaugh's out there, they don't have to even give readings on the other side. So I have this, as some will know, this video blog, the Factual Feminist, and I've just questioned a lot of feminist myths that are taught in the universities about the wage gap and lots of things. I was doing it every week, and now I've stopped, but I'm going to do it more. And I just keep getting letters from kids like, I never heard that before. What? How can this be? And then I realized they don't get it in college, and they probably don't get it in high school. And that's probably where the problems begin. And so it's now, from kindergarten through, it's one set of ideas with the teachers thinking, it doesn't matter because there's Rush Limbaugh out there giving the other side.
I mean, I think one thing, people have been talking a lot about how the absence of conservatives is bad for liberals, but I think it's especially bad for conservatives. That is, conservatives need mentors. They need mentors to teach them how to be conservatives, right? And one of the books that's cited in this is a book I know that we both admire a lot, which is Amy Binder and Kate Wood's book, Becoming Right, which, again, if you haven't read, is a really exceptionally insightful book. It's a comparison of two universities, one's Elite U and the other is a state university. I think everybody in the panel sort of knows which ones they are, but I think I'm under some obligation not to say what they were.
I'll say what they are because it's relevant, actually.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. One of them's CU and one's Harvard, right? So one of the problems, right, is that to be a good conservative, right? And I'm saying this from the outside of somebody who's a liberal who would like there to be better conservatives around, right? Somebody needs to tell them what to read, right? What sort of activism is appropriate to engage in, right? Which is true of going into any kind of field, right? You need to have mentors to look up to tell you here's how you're supposed to behave. And one thing I think that that Binder and Wood say is in the absence of that, which is what at CU, right? These conservatives are kind of being raised by wolves, right? They're picking up their cues from Fox News, talk radio, unscrupulous sources on the internet, and that's why they're going around acting like caricatures of conservatives, right? And that itself then, I think, reinforces people's perceptions of who conservatives are because they're acting exactly like the thing that other people think conservatives are, right? So again, that's where you have a kind of reproducing thing. One of the differences, Ramesh was a student of my old friend Robbie George, right? At Princeton, conservatives have a mentor. They have somebody to look up to, right? To say, this is a model of not just the kind of scholarship you do, but here's how you carry yourself, right? Someone like Robbie is an exceptionally diplomatic person, right? Who kind of shows them, here's how you work inside of an institution, right? Somebody who's built up an enormous power base, right, at an institution, in part because he has extraordinary prudence. He knows when to speak and when not to, how to find levers. And I think that's one thing where conservatives, in the absence of that, right, have to rely on somebody like me, right, who's not a conservative but isn't hostile and has some connections and can, give them things to read. Yeah. But I think the dimension on which the absence of conservatives on campus is bad for conservatives and is bad for the kind of ecosystem that produces new generations of conservatives is a dimension that's probably worth emphasizing.
Yeah, and one of the key differences, of course, between Harvard and CU is there's quite a few conservatives at Harvard, right, from Harvey Mansfield to Craig Mankiw, and despite the Larry Summers business and all that nonsense, right, it's actually a much more open place than we sometimes think, and it matters that there's conservatives there. As a potential Band-Aid on this problem, right, that might help in the absence of more conservatives coming into the university, would be an exchange program, right? So where places like Hillsdale, which has lots of conservatives, they could sort of export them, right? They could send a conservative to Amherst or something, and Amherst could send some lefty to Hillsdale, sort of shake up that place a little bit, and this might be something, right, that could
Student
help.
exchange program.
It's a Fulbright program.
Professor
It's a
exchange.
Fulbright program for academics.
Hillsdale would certainly be more of a culture shock for your Amherst student than Paris. So, Ramesh, there's also a larger point, which I think Steve, which is the point Steve made, just applied more broadly, which is there is this frustration, obviously, not necessarily somewhat in conservative ranks, but probably more broadly in Republican ranks, which has, I think, fueled the appeal of, the various motley crew of characters we saw in 2012, and which has fueled the appeal of Trump. That this notion that those intellectuals don't get us, they're lying to us, they don't care what we think about. And if you're a conservative and you look at the academy, that doesn't feel to me entirely out of whack. But I think it's actually incredibly bad for conservatism because you never want to be an ideology that's unmoored from careful thought, from scrupulous analysis, from empirical testing of your assertions and assumptions. And I think that's where large parts of the Republican Party are today. And I think partly it is inevitably part of this schism between the places that are in the business of doing research and ideas and the political movement.
Right, and I think the one thing just to emphasize is, and especially the problem in the issue with sociology that keeps coming up. And I should just say, I think sociology is a wonderful discipline, right? When done at its best, is extraordinarily important, and in some sense can be quite anti-ideological, right? So you think about the kind of work that ethnographers do, right? Where you have to go, deep, multiple years, sort of swimming in a particular community, right? That's kind of work conservatives need to do more of. Right, in part because that work is going to surprise you, right? It's hard to have all of your ideological predispositions survive simply having to sit with the poor or immigrants or any of these other communities, right? And so I think this is another case where the absence of conservatives from sociology is very deeply problematic for conservatives because a lot of those kind of methods and insights would definitely improve the quality of conservative thought analysis, and that's kind of work that is hard to do at think tanks, right? It's really hard to to do 3-year-long, inner city ethnography. So in that sense, think tanks are not a substitute for the university in that dimension.
Steve, but here's where I'll just push that even if faculty embraced kind of the TELUS notion of let's signal, let's invite these folks in, I am not at all convinced that if you're a graduate student looking to look at homelessness, like the recent book, that if your questions were framed from conservative intuition to conservative values, I am not sure you could get funded. I am not sure that that you would be able to get fair-minded reviews. I am not sure that when you try to get a book contract, you could get fair-minded. I'm just not confident that the ecosystem actually lets you compete on the quality of your work.
You might get investigated.
Well, I mean, just say, I do actually think one thing that's important is there's a very different market in books and journal articles. So I think the last thing you said is wrong, right? That is, this got published by my press, Oxford University Press, where I have a book series, right? Book publishers are much more open than I think journals are, right? And so I think, I think that's one dimension where I think you can go in and become a conservative and frame your analysis from a conservative point of view and publish a book, which you did at a major academic press, right? I think if you try to publish it in journals, which have a very different dimension, in some sense, you're much more deeply constrained by the norms of the field. I think that's one of the questions. Whether you can, especially I think increasingly because book publishers do care what the market is, right? They do care that they thought that Shields and Dunn's book somebody might actually buy, right? Whereas journal editors don't have that same kind of market discipline.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're going to open it up for questions. We've got two of my colleagues have microphones, so please wait for the microphone and then ask a question that is both succinct and takes the form of a question.
My name's Christopher Hale. My question is about the distinctions between the populist movement and the intellectuals in the conservative field. Does that represent a failure of the intellectual conservative movement that Donald Trump is the nominee for president of the United States? Have intellectuals on the right not done a good enough job engaging with the realities of the people on the ground?
Well, that may take us a little bit far afield from the academy question. I would note that, the Republicans are, for all that we're talking about their estrangement from the intellectual world, are nominating somebody who founded a university. So there is that.
Yeah, I don't think that Trump. I mean, Trump's the question of the day, right? And everyone wants to know what the hell's going on, and what's the explanation. I think that you get Trump because of our strange institutions, and our primary system, and that's the larger story. Of course, there's always a sort of disconnect between elites and the public. Maybe it's somewhat larger in the case of conservatives because there are so few conservatives on campus that can sort of direct, right, and educate conservatives, as Steve was saying earlier. But I don't think that's why we get Trump. I think Trump is its own thing, and you can't blame that on the intellectuals. I think that's a problem that's rooted in our primary system and our populist primary system.
Hi, my name is Sarah Rosamoff. I'm a student at Miami University of Ohio, and I just wanted to reiterate the fact that you seem to have a hard obstacle in order to have free discussion and open discussion amongst professors at universities. But do you feel that student organizations promoting these open discussion of ideas would be a better tactic to support as opposed to supporting merely open discussion amongst professors?
Well, I used to believe that, and for years, I and other scholars, I'm not even a conservative, I'm still a registered Democrat, but I'm considered I'm considered a conservative because I have a moderate views on feminism, and for years I would go to campuses invited by these student groups and have a lively discussion, and sometimes the gender studies scholars wouldn't come, but often they would, and we'd debate and sometimes even go out for drinks. Now it's different. And they come to, there are all sorts of antics and safe rooms created where they can flee in case I say something, or not just me. I mean, now look at the people that are being disinvited. Any conservative, even liberals are being disinvited if they don't have an impeccable record on a set of issues. So I would have said, I thought, and in terms of the conservative intellectuals, there was this dynamic effort with the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and I was in AEI, lots of groups, hosting programs for conservative students and intellectual enrichment speakers and so forth. But I just think right now it's not going to work because the forces of the left or whatever they are, therapeutic culture, something on campus is strong, and it's organized and empowered by the Department of Education, and they will limit the power of those student groups.
Right. I mean, also remember, there's no, going to a speaker for an hour every few weeks or every month, right, is no substitute
it's having a mentor.
Is no substitute for, week after week after week of having to really sit down and dig into some subject in detail, right? And that's why I have sympathy with the general argument of the book, right? That what you really need are at least some conservative professors. And now I wouldn't just say conservatives, right? I think Christina's point is right? That eventually the real problem is I would say the silent majority of liberals on campus, right? Again, when I talk to other people who might, around the university, right, there's lots of us, right, who are liberals, right, who vote Democrat, but don't believe in a lot of the stuff and a lot of the ridiculous and the antics, right, and think it's anti-intellectual, right, and think it, again, often that it's driven more by administration than by the faculty, right? The real question, I think, in part is how do you mobilize that silent majority of liberals, right? Who really, I think, still are the majority in lots of places, along with the occasional conservative against both the loud and very mobilized left and the administration, right? That I think is the dynamic, right? So the real question, I think, is how do you mobilize liberals, and I don't know exactly how you do that, right? Again, because lots of those liberals don't even think about their academic vocation as primarily ideological, right? They think of themselves as scholars, right? But part of it is they actually have to think of themselves as having a collective mission, right?
In a funny way, professors aren't activist enough, right? I mean, they're leading
right.
their own sort of lives, but they don't feel they're bad at collective action. And Bloom pointed this out long ago. He said the big problem on campus is that you don't, in closing of the American mind, is that it's easy for universities to fall prey to small minorities because most campuses, professors are sort of free agents. They're sort of fellow travelers on this passenger ship, I think is the metaphor he used. But they don't really feel connected to each other. There's not a deep sense of community. There's no polity there.
What I've been told, by many friends, it's just there's no upside for them getting into this stuff.
Yeah.
Like, why in God's name do you want, if you're University of Missouri, why in God's name do you want to get seen as opposed to inspiring youth fighting for social justice? Like, you may think they're going too far. You may think the folks screaming the quad at Yale are going too far. Yeah. But look, if you actually speak out and say anything negative, you risk getting dragged into fights that are not what you're there to do. They're not your teaching. They're not your scholarship. It's easier to just sit it out.
Also, there are some that have started to speak up.
Very few.
But you also notice that the problems do originate with the students now, except for the odd communications professor at Missouri, yes, asking for muscle.
But this is true in the '60s too, right? It's not usually the case that scholars are trying to silence conversation. The question is, how do scholars respond to either administrative kind of risk aversion or to students?
I do think liberal professors actually have more to fear, perhaps, than conservative professors do from their students, because they tend to teach more politicized classes where these subjects are going to come up, where they're likely to say something that offends the students, and then they're going to be anonymously reported to administration. So conservatives, in a way, get to stand back as amused or bemused bystanders as some of their liberal faculty live in fear now. because of their students.
Right. They're not teaching classes on gender and race. They're teaching microeconomics, and they're not going to get in a lot of hot water for that. But what about bringing market pressures to bear too? I mean, one of the things that we're thinking about doing at Heterodox Academy is doing something called an eggshell-ometer, which will measure, how sort of campus climate, right?
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea.
How do students feel on campus? And you're going to have some very bad offenders, but there's going to be a range, and a lot of parents and young people, I think, would want to know that, right? So I'm hearing from a lot of young professors,
a lot of young. Where should I send?
Where should I send them, right? And I think that's I think we can do help students.
That's a good
right?
idea.
I think FIRE's, free speech watch.
That's very good.
It's
Yeah,
certainly,
the 10 worst campuses for
the green
freedom.
lights, absolutely make it. I mean, partly that's right. Trying to give folks a way to Steve's point, get past some of the anecdote and.
Well, if you look at what happened in Missouri, evidently the applications are down
20%.
substantially. Donations are down. That's the market at work.
Mm-hmm.
Up here.
Thanks. Michael Polyakov, American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Over the years, we've done a certain number of surveys on campus, and there are two questions we ask, among others. One is of students, do you feel that you need to agree with your professor in order to get a good grade? And the other one is, to what extent does your professor bring in topics that are irrelevant to the subject of the course? Now, these are, of course, self-referential. The students are answering with, and we have no control over that. But the figures are pretty stunning. 30 to 40% of the students saying that they see these things which are kind of offenses against professional practice, to say the least. So my question is this just kvetching? Or are these the sorts of indicators that campuses ought to be looking at seriously? And if so, shouldn't this become kind of standard practice across campuses?
I don't think it's just complaining, it is a violation of professional norms. If you just look at the required classes that students have to take, and the disciplines that they're going to have to take the classes in, it's not surprising that so many would report that. So it's good that that is out there, and I think it's all for the best that it gets publicized as widely as possible. So no, it's not just complaining.
The one thing I would say is the only people who I'd less rather run universities than the professors are the administrators, right? That is many of the things people think of as remedies you might do, right? Or think, oh, well, we need to have more administrative oversight of professors, right? But the administrators are much worse than the faculty in most of these cases, right? If anything, a large part of the problem is, again, the growth. I mean, I'll just use my university. I can say I have tenure, so I can say this, right? Our residence life unit has a whole thing in the front of their web page that says, something to the effect of, you may think that you're coming to campus to take classes with professors, right? But most of your intellectual life will be in your residence hall or something like that, right? So they're actively trying to grab for power. The last thing I would want, even if you think the purpose of it is to help out the students you want to do, right? The last thing you want to do is give any more power to that class of the university, right? I think one of the questions I think for me is, how do you cut down all that administration, in part by forcing the faculty to go back into the actual administration of the university, right? Again, in large part, as you were suggesting, the faculty has themselves given this up, right? Because they want to be working on their own research. They want to be doing that, in part because the academic labor market is so mobile now, right? People move around, and therefore they have less of an incentive to care about their own institution, because they really want to know whether their human capital is going to be exchangeable to some other institution, right? And what they do at their own institution doesn't add to their human capital when they try and get that next job, right? And I think that's part of the nut you've got to crack. In the first instance, I think you have to put power back in the hands of the departments, of the faculty, and then you need to put pressure on those faculty to be more open to a wider range of political ideologies in social science and humanities, right? But don't try and solve the problem by empowering exactly the wrong people in the university.
Many people told us that as well in our interviews, that they spent most of their time forming coalitions with their colleagues, fellow professors, to fight bad ideas from administration. One told us that every bad idea that he had had to fight against had come from administration. I'm certain that's an overstatement, but that's how strongly he felt that the administration was the source of the problem.
In the back. Yes. So power to the professors will be our slogan.
Better than
Now
the
work
other
with
option.
conservatives.
Hi, my name is Brandon Yates. I'm a student at Colorado Christian University, and I am in the political science program, and I've had the chance to be mentored by some of those conservative humanities professors that you've been talking about so desperately needing. But my question is more about the hard sciences and less about the humanities. In two documentaries, one produced by Ben Stein called Expel, talking about biology and creation science, and the other one, Climate Hustle, very recent, by Mark Morano, documenting climatology, it seems that the discrimination against conservatives isn't just in the soft sciences, but is also in the harder sciences, where anthropogenic climate change and evolution have had a stranglehold on many of the journals, on the hiring process, and elsewhere. So I guess my question is to the authors and to the entire panel, are these dynamics not only prevalent in the soft sciences or social sciences, but also present in the hard sciences? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. We intentionally, of course, we didn't study the natural sciences, largely because we don't think that politics presents a permanent problem in those fields, right? One can point to special cases, right, where politics is important in the natural sciences. I think global warming is a very good example. But in most of the natural sciences, I think that politics just doesn't matter very much, right? I mean, we sort of make this case in the book, right? So if every engineer in the country was a Marxist, nobody would care that much, right? It would be sort of an odd fact of engineering. But there would be no David Horowitz, barnstorming the country, trying to rally conservatives because he's worried that engineering might be taught from a Marxist slant, right? Or engineering research might be done in a Marxist way. That having said that, there may be cases, right? Special cases where it's an issue, and it's we neglect it in the book, frankly.
Hi, Will Baird. I'm here at AEI. So we've talked a lot today about the importance of open dialogue and the importance of free speech. I think those are very good arguments to make for conservative and libertarians on campus. But isn't part of the kind of rash of disinvitations and safe spaces and trigger warnings an attempt to kind of shift kind of the normative bounds? And isn't it also important to partner these arguments about free speech with arguments in favor of conservative libertarian norms? Because, and the KKK can hold a protest, and they can do it on free speech, but no one really wants to be associated with them. So isn't it also important to say that these ideas have value in and of themselves, not just because we have a right to make our views heard?
Yeah, well, if I understand the question, right, you're saying that we should be arguing not just for openness, but for the contributions, the importance. And we do in the book, right? I mean, I think when fields become too homogeneous, it becomes really hard for them to converge on the best approximation of the truth, because there aren't many conservatives about, right? And so that means that they don't consider a broader range of research questions or interpretations. And and confirmation bias is a very powerful thing, right? That is to say, we all tend to accept facts and explanations when they fit our pre-existing views. And so if you really want to be challenged, right, if you really want to identify what's wrong with your own thinking, it really helps to have people on the other side who are willing to challenge them. And then I think it's also true that there's certain sort of currents from the conservative Enlightenment that are not very well represented in the academy, right? So I think libertarians, for example, have done much better than cultural conservatives, right? The descendants of Adam Smith, right, are much more numerous and vocal than, say, the descendants of Burke or David Hume. And one of the problems we identify in the book is that there aren't enough disciplinary, I think, spaces for cultural conservatives. I think the natural home, in some ways, for cultural conservatives is sociology, because they take, institutions like the family and religion seriously. Whereas libertarians, I think, a lot of them can find a pretty comfortable home in economics. That's a field that's become much more friendly to actually libertarian ideas, as I suggested to Rick earlier. Even as I think the academy has become somewhat less friendly to cultural conservatives, and we need more of those voices around.
Right, and I do think it's important. I mean, there's a distinction when you think about the conservative speakers who come to campus. The ones who really add something are ones who, in a way, accept many of the norms of social science or humanities, right, and are saying within that, right, here's a different way to think about what the outcome should be, right? The problem often is when you get conservatives who get sent to campus almost purely just to piss people off,
like
right?
Ann Coulter or something.
Yeah, I mean, that's problematic. Again, the distinction, right? In my last book, The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement, one of the things I argued that was successful at the Federalist Society, right, is they were sending people to law schools who were very distinguished scholars, right, who would then argue with existing, faculty, right, and people could look at it and say, look, that person's just as good a scholar as the person they're arguing with, right, as opposed to somebody, again, who reinforces the idea that they're, that conservatives are this caricature they see in the media, right? And that are really just an invitation for repression, right? Some of this is that they're designed to sort of be bait for campuses to go and try and shut down, right? It's a lot harder to shut somebody. I brought Larry Mead in to, who's associated with AI to talk on my campus, right? He's got as much social science chops as anybody on campus, right? They're not going to go and shut him down, hopefully. I don't even know what I would do if they tried. But I think that's one thing where it's very important to distinguish between those two kinds of things as to both their effect on students and what the intention is.
But just to the questioner's point, I think it's a terrific point that it's not just the notion that universities ought to be more, ought to be less stifling and do less to stymie speech. It's that conservatism in particular is rooted in a series of intuitions about human behavior, about what makes for strong and good societies. And the fact that these things are so absent in areas that deal fundamentally with humanities, with the meaning of culture, with how we understand the culture in which we live, that are absent in analysis of politics and sociology. This is a problem when it means that certain assumptions around liberty, around how we ought to think about the role of race, about the role of moral agency and personal responsibility, when these issues are getting set aside in favor of constructs rooted in gender and race and power disequilibria, it means that we wind up having conversations in the academy that are almost entirely framed from one shared perspective and that take us in one particular direction, when that is divorced from how half of the country, give or take, tends to think about these things and talk about them, it's hugely problematic on both counts. It creates a professoriate and students who don't understand much about the way half their fellow citizens think, and it means that we get a conservative party that is lacking in the kind of serious, engaged, research, serious, engaged, kind of pressure-tested argument that makes for serious policy and political discourse.
Well, I think serious and engaged are terrific descriptions of the panel we've had, which unfortunately now has to come to a close. But I hope you will join me in applauding our terrific speakers for their contribution.
Christina, tell me why you left philosophy. I'm curious about your background.
Oh, I didn't leave it. I just